For thousands of years, anthropologists have explained human diversity through slow evolutionary adaptation. Melanin levels adjusting to UV exposure, body types shifting with climate, features changing across isolated populations over countless generations. The story is neat, linear, scientific. But what if the world's oldest written records tell a different story entirely? In the dust-covered cuneiform tablets of ancient Sumer, dating back to 3500 BCE, we find descriptions of humanity's creation that read less like mythology and more like documentation. Powerful beings called the Anunnaki, described not as mystical gods but as pragmatic engineers, shaped the first humans through what the texts describe as a deliberate physical process. They mixed what they called the clay of earth with divine essence. They implanted this mixture into surrogate birth goddesses. They solved a labor crisis with biological engineering. And buried within these same ancient texts is a clue that mainstream archaeology struggles to explain. The Sumerians called themselves the Sagiga, the black-headed people. Not humanity, not the civilized ones, the black-headed people. You don't define yourself by a common physical trait unless you're distinguishing yourself from others who lack it. Unless there were others. Unless the Anunnaki didn't create just one type of human, they created all of them. The Atrahasis epic, one of the oldest surviving narratives in human history, opens with a problem that has nothing to do with spiritual salvation or cosmic meaning. It's about labor. The lesser Anunnaki gods, called the Agigi, had been forced to mine Earth's resources for thousands of years, grueling, endless physical work that finally broke them. The tablets describe their rebellion in stark terms. They burned their tools, they surrounded the house of Enlil, the commander, in the night, and they refused to continue. The Anunnaki leadership faced a crisis that required an immediate, practical solution. Enki, the god of wisdom, and what the texts repeatedly characterize as scientific knowledge, proposed something that had never been attempted: create a new being to bear the work. Not through magic, through a process. The tablets describe this process with unusual specificity. Enki instructed that they take the clay of the earth, a term that many researchers interpret not as literal soil, but as the existing hominid life already present on the planet, perhaps Homo erectus or another proto-human species. This biological base material was then mixed with the blood of Weila, a slain god, to impart intelligence and consciousness, what we might now call genetic modification using Anunnaki DNA. The mixture was placed into the wombs of Anunnaki birth goddesses, who carried these hybrid beings to term. The result was the Lulu Amelu, the mixed worker, the first human. These beings were designed with a purpose. They would perform the physical labor that had driven the Agigi to revolt, freeing the Anunnaki to return to whatever broader mission had brought them to Earth in the first place. The tablets don't describe creation as a gift. They describe it as manufacturing. And if the Anunnaki were solving a practical problem through genetic engineering, then every choice they made about how we were built had a reason behind it. The Sumerians left behind thousands of clay tablets, administrative records, hymns, and epics. And across these texts, they used one consistent phrase to describe themselves: Sagiga, the black-headed people, not the people of Sumer, not the civilized ones, not humanity, the black-headed people. On the surface, scholars have treated this as a cultural identifier, perhaps metaphorical, perhaps poetic. But language reveals how a culture sees itself in relation to others. When a civilization consistently defines itself by a physical characteristic, it implies the existence of a contrasting group. You don't call yourself the black-headed people unless you've encountered or know about people whose heads aren't black, people with different hair, different features, different appearances. The texts offer no explanation for why this distinction mattered. They simply use the term repeatedly, as if the difference was obvious and required no justification. This raises questions the tablets themselves never directly address. Were the Sag-Giga the first successful prototype, the original model created in the laboratories of Eridu where Enki conducted his work? Or were they one variant among many, a localized version of humanity built specifically for Mesopotamia, while other models were being developed elsewhere? The Anunnaki's operations, according to these same texts, weren't confined to a single region. References throughout Sumerian literature point to mining activities in the Abzu, often interpreted as sub-Saharan Africa and other distant lands. If their resource extraction was global in scope, then the single human model created in Sumer wouldn't have been sufficient. Different climates, different altitudes, different environmental pressures would have required different physical adaptations. Not random mutations across millennia. Deliberate modifications from the beginning. The term Sag-Giga might be the oldest evidence we have that the Anunnaki didn't create one humanity. They created variations of humanity. And if that's true, then the question becomes, what determined those variations and what purpose did each serve? If Enki designed the Lulu Amalu to solve a labor problem, then the question isn't whether he would have modified humans for different conditions, it's why he wouldn't have. The Anunnaki didn't operate from a single temple complex. The tablets describe mining operations in the Abzu, distant mountains, regions far beyond Mesopotamia's river valleys. Each location presented different environmental challenges. Each required workers who could survive and function in those specific conditions. Dark skin isn't an aesthetic choice in evolutionary biology. It's a response to ultraviolet radiation. Melanin absorbs UV light, protecting DNA from damage in regions where the sun strikes the Earth most directly. For workers laboring under the equatorial sun of sub-Saharan Africa, increased melanin would have been essential, not something that gradually developed over 50,000 years of slow adaptation, but something built into the design from the beginning. If you were engineering a workforce for the mines of the Abzu, you would give them dark skin for the same reason you would give deep-sea creatures pressure-resistant biology, because the environment demands it. The inverse holds true for northern latitudes. Lighter skin allows more efficient vitamin D synthesis in regions with less direct sunlight, preventing bone disorders and immune deficiencies that would cripple a labor force. If Anunnaki operations extended into Europe or northern Asia, workers there would need reduced melanin, not as a sign of superiority or inferiority, but as a functional adaptation to local conditions. The same pragmatic logic that drove the creation of humans in the first place would have driven the creation of variants. The Sumerian texts never describe the Anunnaki as sentimental creators, crafting humanity in a single divine image. They describe engineers solving resource extraction problems. Engineers who, when faced with a global operation spanning climates from tropical to Arctic, would have done exactly what modern synthetic biology does: optimize the organism for the environment. The Sag-Giga, the black-headed people of Mesopotamia, may have been the version suited to riverine agriculture and moderate sun exposure. Other regions would have received other models. What we call human diversity might not be the result of populations slowly drifting apart across continents. It might be the signature of a deliberate, systematic engineering project that built different humans for different jobs in different places from the very beginning. The Sumerian text Enki and Ninmah preserves a strange narrative that sits uneasily within the usual mythological framework. After the successful creation of the Lulu Amelu, Enki and the birth goddess Ninmah engage in what the tablet describes as a drunken creation contest. They begin producing humans with various physical anomalies. One who cannot hold things properly, one who cannot control their bladder, one who is barren, one whose body is malformed. The text presents these as failures, mistakes made in a moment of divine carelessness. But what if we're reading the story wrong? In any complex engineering project, the final product emerges from iterations. Early prototypes reveal flaws. Variables need adjustment. What works in controlled conditions fails under real-world stress. The text may be preserving, in the distorted language of myth, A memory of exactly this kind of experimental phase. Not drunken mistakes, but systematic trials testing different genetic configurations, some stable, others not. Modern genetic engineering produces similar results. CRISPR experiments generate unexpected traits. Gene expression varies across individuals. Not every modification survives, and not every surviving modification looks the same. If Enki was genuinely manipulating the biological material the tablets call clay, mixing it with Anunnaki genetic essence, then variation wouldn't just be possible, it would be inevitable. The question isn't whether failed or unexpected variants emerged. The question is what happened to the ones that survived, but didn't match the intended baseline. Some variations might have been sterile, dead ends, exactly as the text describes. Others might have been viable but different. Different bone structure, different facial features, different pigmentation, different hair texture. Not failures, stable alternatives. If these variants could work, could reproduce, could perform the required labor, even if they didn't match the Mesopotamian standard, why wouldn't Enki have deployed them? Why waste a functional design? The Sagiga might represent the perfected model, the configuration that Enki and Ninmah settled on for Sumer after their period of experimentation. But the experiments themselves, the versions that came before, the unexpected results that proved viable, those could have been the origin of human physical diversity. Not created through different deliberate processes in different locations, but emerging from a single chaotic creative period where the Anunnaki were still learning how human genetics responded to their manipulations. Our differences might be the beautiful, unintended consequence of gods who were making it up as they went along. The Anunnaki were never a unified force. The tablets make that clear. Enki and his half-brother Enlil clashed constantly, over jurisdiction, over methods, over humanity itself. Enki, described as humanity's advocate, the god who warned Ziusudra of the coming flood. Enlil, the stern commander who viewed humans as noisy disruptions and voted repeatedly for their extermination. These weren't philosophical disagreements. These were territorial power struggles between factions that controlled different regions, different resources, different operations across the planet. Which raises a question the tablets hint at, but never directly state. If rival Anunnaki factions controlled different territories, would they have shared the same human workforce? In every colonial system, markers of ownership matter. Brands on livestock, uniforms on soldiers, flags over territories. If Enki's faction operated mines in southern Africa while Enlil's controlled operations in the north, physical differentiation between their respective human populations wouldn't just be practical, it would be politically necessary. You need to know, at a glance, which workers belong to which overseer, which group answers to which god. Skin color would serve that purpose perfectly, not as accident, as assignment. The Sagiga, the black-headed people, emerged in Eridu, Enki's city, Enki's temple, Enki's center of power. The texts consistently associate them with southern Mesopotamia, the marshlands, the region under Enki's direct control. If this was his prototype, his population, then other Anunnaki leaders creating their own workforce elsewhere would have needed their own identifiers. Different hair, different skin, different features marking territorial division as clearly as any border. This wouldn't require separate creation events. It would only require modification of the base model, adjusting melanin production here, bone structure there, hair texture somewhere else. Small genetic tweaks that produced visible, permanent, heritable differences. Not random drift over millennia. Deliberate branding from the beginning. The conflicts described in Sumerian literature, the struggles between Enki and Enlil, the division of Earth into controlled regions, the constant maneuvering for advantage. These weren't abstract divine dramas. They were management disputes in a resource extraction operation. And in that context, Creating physically distinct human populations assigned to different overseers makes perfect administrative sense. Our diversity wouldn't be evidence of separation and independent evolution. It would be evidence of a command structure preserved in our genetics, marking which faction of humanity belonged to which Anunnaki master 5,000 years after their administration collapsed. Mainstream science tells us that human skin color evolved gradually as populations migrated out of Africa, adapting over tens of thousands of years to new UV exposure levels in different latitudes. The mechanism is elegant: natural selection, favoring melanin retention near the equator, melanin reduction near the poles, random genetic drift filling in the spectrum between. The timeline is vast, the process is passive, and the conclusion is clear. Our physical differences are accidents of geography and time. But the Sumerian tablets describe something else entirely. They describe creation through deliberate mixture of terrestrial and divine biological material. They describe pragmatic gods solving labor problems through engineering. They describe a civilization calling itself the black-headed people, as if that specific physical marker distinguished them from known others. And they describe experimental creation phases, territorial divisions between rival divine factions, and global operations that would have required workers adapted to radically different environments. What if the scientific narrative has the causation backwards? What if we weren't adapted to different environments through slow natural selection after migrating to them, but were designed for those environments before being placed in them? If the Anunnaki needed workers in equatorial Africa, they would build humans with high melanin from the start. If they needed workers in northern territories, they would reduce melanin for vitamin D efficiency. If different factions controlled different regions, they would mark their populations with distinct features the same way any colonial administrator marks assets. The engineering logic is straightforward, the motive is clear, and the result, humanity's rich physical diversity, appearing in the archaeological record faster than standard evolutionary models comfortably predict, matches what you would expect from designed variation rather than accumulated mutation. The tablets never say the Anunnaki created all humans identical and let nature sort out the differences. They say the Anunnaki created humans for specific purposes in specific locations under specific conditions. They describe a project, not a miracle, and projects of that scope, operating across a planet with wildly different climates and controlled by competing administrative factions, would produce exactly what we see: distinct human populations with adaptations that seem almost too perfect for their environments to be coincidental, appearing too quickly in the timeline to fit comfortably within gradualist models, and carrying a legacy of separation that persists in our genetics long after any memory of the original purpose has vanished. We are told our differences are skin-deep, evolutionary accidents of no fundamental significance. But if the Sumerian account preserves even a distorted memory of real events, then those differences might be the last visible evidence of an ancient engineering specification. Not markers of division we created, but markers of function they designed. The Sagiga knew they were distinct. They said so in every text they left behind. The question we've stopped asking is, distinct from whom? And why did they? That distinction matter enough to be written into the oldest records of human civilization? The Sumerian tablets are the oldest written documents humanity possesses. They predate every religious text, every historical chronicle, every philosophical tradition we consider foundational to civilization. And they describe our creation not as a supernatural act of pure divinity, but as a response to a labor shortage. A solution engineered by beings the texts characterize as pragmatic, territorial, and deeply invested in resource extraction across the entire planet. Mainstream archaeology treats these narratives as metaphor, symbolic stories explaining the rise of agriculture, the emergence of cities, the beginning of written culture. But metaphors don't include precise procedural descriptions. They don't specify that creation involved mixing terrestrial biological material with divine essence and implanting it in surrogate wombs. They don't preserve the term Sagiga across Thousands of texts, as if physical appearance was the defining characteristic separating one group from all others. If we take the tablets at face value, not as literal instruction manuals, but as attempts by ancient scribes to record events they only partially understood, then we're left with a profoundly different origin story. One where human diversity isn't the accidental byproduct of migration and slow adaptation, but the intentional output of a systematic engineering effort that built different populations for different climates, different tasks, different administrative zones controlled by rival factions of the same species we call gods. Were the Anunnaki extraterrestrials, an advanced precursor civilization, survivors of a previous world? The tablets themselves don't answer that question clearly enough to settle the debate. But they do answer a question we've stopped asking. Were we made this way on purpose? According to the oldest written testimony we have, the answer is yes. Modern genetics tells us that all humans share more than 99% of our DNA, that our differences are superficial, recent, and insignificant. Yet those tiny variations appeared remarkably quickly in evolutionary terms, clustered in ways that correlate almost perfectly with environmental pressures, as if something accelerated the process far beyond what random mutation typically allows. The Standard Model calls this natural selection working efficiently. The Sumerian model calls it Enki working efficiently. We've spent centuries trying to explain away the implications of our oldest records, filing them under mythology and moving on to more comfortable narratives. But the tablets are still there. The term Sagiga is still there. The creation accounts describing mixture, gestation, and deliberate production are still there. And the questions they raise about who we are, where we came from, and what purpose we were built to serve remain unanswered. Not because the texts are silent, but because we've chosen not to listen. If the Anunnaki were real, then everything we think we know about human history begins not with the first cities, but with the first laboratories. And the story written in our DNA might not be a record of where we wandered, but a blueprint of what we were designed to do.